Hi, I'm Theodorou. I am a therapist at New Counseling Services in Bergen County, New Jersey. And today I want to take a few moments to discuss anxiety, specifically how anxiety is very much related to the fear of losing control. In my experience as a clinician treating various anxiety disorders, what I've come to find across the board is that clients that struggle with high levels of anxiety struggle with the fear of losing control. And what I mean by they struggle with the fear of losing control is that someone that is very much an anxious person tends to demand certainty and predictability from a world that, for the most part, is largely tentative and uncertain. So for those of us that don't suffer an anxiety disorder, it might just be a given for us that, well, everything about life could be viewed as uncertain and unpredictable. But if you're someone that has an anxious temperament, it causes a lot of distress for you. I think the crux of the problem for people with anxiety is they tend to develop maladaptive behaviors to manage their anxiety. And as a clinician, we call those safety-seeking behaviors, and those are unhealthy coping mechanisms a person with anxiety has that kind of exacerbates the problem, because the person with anxiety then thinks that their safety-seeking behavior is the reason why they're not having an anxiety attack or a panic attack, when really all that does is make the fear, which is normally an irrational fear, grow larger in that person. So what is a safety-seeking behavior? So, for instance, if you knew someone who maybe is phobic of driving on the highway, and the maladaptive behavior they develop is to take the back roads to work instead of facing their fear and driving on the highway, what you'll come to find is they're not going to feel anxious about driving on the highway because they found a way to work around that. Of course, in the interim, their fear of driving on the highway is going to grow exponentially because they're not facing that fear. It's the same, a common phobia that I think most people know at least one person with is the fear of flying. So someone that's afraid to fly will drive across the country rather than take a 5-hour flight. For those of us who aren't afraid to fly, we view that as irrational and a waste of time and just, why can't they just get on the plane? But for someone with a phobia of flying, they feel that, they're saving their life by driving across the country, because often people are afraid the plane will crash. Interestingly enough, the people that I've worked with that have been afraid of flying, while they have discussed with me the fear of the plane crashing, many more discussed the fear of being trapped on the plane and having a panic attack. So kind of like that claustrophobic feeling, and also going back to the fear of losing control. Because all of us, when we're on a plane, in theory, we can't just walk off the plane whenever we want. So for someone that needs to be in control, that's really going to trigger their anxiety. But moving along, those are specific phobias. Being afraid to drive on the highway or being afraid to fly, those are very specific. And it's very common to develop a safety-seeking behavior for those two fears. But for people that suffer from generalized anxiety or have a lot of free-floating anxiety, which is just, in general, they don't feel at ease. In their day-to-day life, they feel very anxious and uneasy. They might take it to a more extreme level. So someone that just has a very anxious temperament may start to make their world more constricted. And what I mean by more constricted, if you're someone that has high levels of anxiety across the board, you may only take jobs at certain companies where, you won't be required to travel, or you won't have to drive on the highway to get there. So like where you could have very predictable job duties and responsibilities, and while you may be handicapping your ability to progress in your career, that's a sacrifice you're willing to make to keep your anxiety levels low. As it relates to one's personal life, if you are someone that struggles with high levels of anxiety, you might constrict your life to the point where you're almost living in a bubble. You might only be able to go to certain restaurants or go visit certain places for vacation because the fear of the unknown is just too much for you. Even in your personal relationships, you might keep a small circle of people that you feel you could control or predict, that just that element of not knowing what to expect from someone would not be something you'd be able to handle. So from my perspective as a clinician, when I'm working with someone that has a lot of anxiety, if their fear is something for like spiders isn't going to be a fear that really impacts your life. It's not going to impact your job prospects or your relationships with other people or limit your ability to travel or what have you. So that's something that I feel, if that's your phobia, that's okay. But if you're afraid of driving on the highway to the point where the way you handle it is maybe you make your spouse always take the back roads and you take the back roads to work, what are you going to do one day when you have to drive with coworkers to a work conference and you have to drive on the highway? You're going to be in a tough spot there because you've been using a safety-seeking behavior to get around that phobia, and now you're going to be in a position where you're being forced to face that fear, and that might cause a person to have an anxiety attack or a panic attack, or even pretend to get sick to go home from work to avoid it, and very unhealthy ways of dealing with that anxiety. So the reason I want to talk a little bit about the fear of losing control is because anyone that struggles with anxiety is going to seek to control the external world. And the problem, as all of us probably know, is there is no really controlling the external world. My colleague recently did a video on coping with the uncertainty of this pandemic, and that's a great example of an external factor that none of us can control. No one could foresee a pandemic coming, and no one could, make it end. We just have to wait it out. We're all in this together. And for someone that struggles with anxiety, this is probably a very hard time for them. Especially if it's impacting the routine of their life. Because routine is very important for anyone that struggles with anxiety. They need a very structured existence. And I think we all know people like that in our life. And I think some people are very good at masking their anxiety, but in high stress situations, like that mask of being put together is going to slip, and you're going to see that this is someone that really does struggle to cope with uncertainty. So that was just, a brief overview about fear of losing control and uncertainty, and how people develop maladaptive safety-seeking behaviors. And if you find that you are someone that maybe does have some unhealthy coping mechanisms, or have constricted your life to be a little bit smaller to cope with your anxiety, I think now would be a great time to seek out counseling to see if you could begin the process of overcoming those fears and being a more confident person. What I always tell my clients, that I don't care what your fear is, if you peel back the layers, underneath any fear is the feeling that you can't handle it. Because if you could handle whatever life throws at you, there's no reason to be anxious. So that's also something that we would want to work on in counseling, is developing your ability to cope with whatever life's going to throw your way. Because I think often what makes people anxious is they feel that they can't handle whatever it is they're afraid of. And that's just not true. So if you find that you relate to anything I'm talking about, please feel free to reach out to me. I hope that this video has been beneficial. Like I said, you could reach out to me on theodorouTherapy.com. I work at a new counseling services in Oradell, New Jersey. And you could also find me on Facebook at Therapy Thoughts. That's my Facebook page. And I hope you have a good day and be well.